Welcome everybody. It's fantastic to see so many people here. I can see the numbers are still clicking up, so that's really brilliant. Um, it's 2 years since we did our last webinar. It feels like it's flown on one level and it's been a long time on another. We expect to be with you for about an hour today. We are going to record this webinar and we will put it on YouTube. So if there's anything that you miss or anything that you want to re-listen to, it will be there for you in the next couple of days. Let's introduce ourselves first. I'm Lisa Pascoe. I'm the Deputy Director of Regulation and Social Care Policy here at Ofsted. I'm joined today by Matthew.
Thanks, Lisa. Yeah. Hi, everyone. Matthew Brazier, Ofsted's Specialist Advisor for Looked After Children and the Project Director.
Hi there, my name is Rosie Davie. I'm one of the Regulatory Inspection Managers for Supported Accommodation.
So we're going to turn our cameras off now, which hopefully will help with technical issues as well as everything else. But also that's designed to help you concentrate on what's on the screen. Today, we're going to mainly focus on the inspection arrangements. I know that's what you will be really interested in. And as I'm sure you know, they will be starting from September. But it also feels like a really good opportunity to recap on some of the key issues that you've been asking questions about, some of the things that you might be less familiar with, and also tell you a little bit about what's been happening, where we are, let you know where we're up to with our registration work, because I'm sure you still have questions about that too. You have sent in a lot of questions in advance, which is brilliant. We've done our best to cover them with the content today, and there will be times when I stop and I ask questions of Matthew and Rosie. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat as well. So if there are questions that arise as we're talking, I will be keeping an eye on those. So do use that opportunity as well. If we get to the end of this, we still haven't answered your question, I'll put up some contact details at the end, and you can use those to continue to have conversations with us outside of this webinar. Just as an aside, before we get into the supported accommodation, some of you might be aware of something called the Big Listen. This was a huge consultation across all of Ofsted's work, led by our new Chief Inspector, Martin Oliver. He was asking questions about what we do, how we do it, and how we can be the best possible regulator and inspectorate. So we haven't analysed all the responses yet, but watch out for something in September that will tell you the outcome of the Big Listen. But for today, let's focus on supported accommodation and where we are. So let's take a quick look at what's got us to this stage. Have a look at our timeline. Lots has happened, as I say, over the last couple of years. We have journeyed from working with the department on what the regulations might look like, agreeing that provider-led system, which is very different. And again, we'll probably touch on that with you today. The DfE published their standards, regulation and guidance well over a year ago now. It's really important that people are familiar with those. We started to register in April, and Rosie will give you a recap on where we're up to with registration. Thank you to all of you who contributed to our inspection consultation over the summer last year. And from February this year, you've had access to our inspection guidance. And again, I can't emphasise strongly enough, please read that inspection guidance. It should hopefully answer any questions that you've got. And as we're here today to talk about, from September, we'll start inspecting supported accommodation. Matthew, going to hand over to you to give people a bit more detail.
Okay, yeah, so categories of accommodation. We just thought it'd be helpful again to look at the different categories of accommodation in case people are less familiar with, for people who are less familiar with it. And these distinct categories of accommodation illustrate the diverse and varied nature of supported accommodation. So I'll just go through them quickly. Single occupancy essentially means self-contained accommodation where young people aren't reliant to any significant degree on any shared communal facilities such as kitchens or lounge areas. The second and third categories, on the other hand, are group living arrangements where there are shared communal facilities with other residents. But those two categories are differentiated by one being ring-fenced or limited to looked after children and care leavers, although not limited to 16 and 17-year-olds, whereas the other one, number 3, is not limited either by age or care status. And the 4th one, usually known as supported lodgings, where young people are living in accommodation provided by an individual in their private home. Now, all these categories can accommodate young people aged 18 or over, but providers only need to register if they plan to accommodate looked after children and care leavers aged 16 or 17. Providers aren't limited to being registered for any one category, but they can't provide a category of accommodation for which they're not currently registered without applying for a variation and receiving approval for a change to their registration.
Thanks, Matthew. So before we get into the inspection, as I said at the start, Rosie's going to give us a bit of an update on where we are in dealing with registration applications. As you know, we agreed with the Department for Education that we will prioritise this work, and that's why we're starting inspections from September. So, Rosie.
So we did some surveys before we began to accept applications, and as you probably know, we had more applications than we had expected. So by the beginning of July 2024, we had more than 1,300 supported accommodation applications that we had accepted as being complete and were ready for registration visits. And of that number of providers, we've now registered 440. You also are aware that there was a deadline of the 28th of October, after which providers needed to be either registered or to have an application accepted as complete in order to operate legally. So nearly 800 providers met that deadline, and around 550 had submitted an application, but it was too late to be accepted as complete. And one of the things that we have been clear about is that if those applications were from providers who were already operating, that we would take a pragmatic case-by-case approach to any action that we might take. But we were also really clear that anyone not already operating or having submitted an application after the 28th of October shouldn't operate until they were fully registered. And as you also know, all of the local authorities have access to a list of all legal provision, which gives the details of all the available premises for supported accommodation.
Yeah, and one of the things that people are a little bit confused about out there, which is really good for us to clarify today, is what the unique reference number means, which is the URN. So they are issued to us as part of the application process when we ask a provider to pay their application fee. And it's really important that everybody understands that having a URN does not mean that a provider is registered or that they are able to operate legally while we make a decision on their application. It just means that they've applied and paid the fee. So for local authorities, that local authority portal that you have access to shows the active providers. That's people who are actively registered. They've completed the whole process and they've got their certificate from Ofsted. And it also tells you about the proposed providers who made that deadline that Rosie's just set out. Those 800 providers who made that deadline to operate legally because they'd got a complete application accepted and paid their fee. Rosie.
So we are processing all applications as quickly as we can. And as I've said, we've registered over 400, but we've actually visited 85% of all of the providers who met the October deadline, but also a good proportion of others who didn't meet the deadline. We expect to have visited the vast majority of applicants by the end of this year. It's realistic to say that anybody applying now will have to wait until next year before we visit to evaluate their application fully and reach a decision on their application. We are refusing some applications, and most commonly this is due to applicants' lack of skill, experience or understanding of the supported accommodation regulations. It's worth just adding that most of the applications do need some additional work, for example, on the policies, just to be able to meet the regulations. So please do respond to any requests that we make for information as quickly as possible. Those requests for information might come from our applications team or our business support team, or indeed from the inspector that's been allocated to evaluate the application. We also share a survey with applicants to ask for their feedback, and please do complete that because it helps to improve the work that we do.
So I think we'll pause for a couple of questions that have come in. Matthew, there's been a question about if you were registered first, does that mean you're inspected first?
No, it doesn't. We take a number of issues into consideration about whether, when we schedule the inspections, that might be around based on the information we've received, such as notifications or complaints we might have had. So that might lead us to prioritise a visit. But for supported accommodation, especially at first, we want to see a good balance of different types of providers, large or small, and not just those we might be more worried about. We'd really like to see some, balance of quality, but not in order of registration, because that really might give you too much of a clue when we're coming.
Yeah, that makes sense. From a broad question to quite a narrow question, Rosie, do windows require restrictors?
Okay, so the guide to supported accommodation and the regulations talk about how staff should work collaboratively with children to help them to understand how to keep safe and to minimise any potential risks of harm. And that's the key thing that we'll be looking at when we come out to see you. The regulations and the quality standards don't specifically talk about windows or window restrictors, so we wouldn't apply a blanket rule around that. And so it's for the provider to assess the suitability of the risk from each premises. And so if it is relevant, that might include the risk of falling from a window. And that would really be specific to each individual premises that the providers put forward.
Thanks, Rosie. I know we also get asked questions about DBS, and one of those is whether everybody has to have online DBS and what are the frequency for checking. So there's two things people need to look at here. For applications to Ofsted, yes, please look at our registration guidance, and we do ask for people to have online DBS. But if it's for your own purposes, so thinking of the people you recruit, look at the guidance for employees on .gov.uk around DBS itself. They have lots of guidance on their website, and it's really important you familiarise yourself with the bits that are relevant to you. And Rosie, you mentioned earlier that we have refused some applications to register with us.
Yes.
If you disagree with that, what can people do? What's the process?
Well, the first thing is that people can disagree with us if we tell them that we intend to refuse an application, because what we would do at that point is issue something called a notice of proposal to refuse, and within that there is a clear line that enables providers to make representations if they don't agree with our proposal. I would really urge people to look at the registration guidance, which will give you more details about what might happen next if you were to find yourself in that situation. But the key points are that, yes, providers can let us know that they, for whatever reason, may not agree with our proposal to refuse through their representations, and they would have a time limit within which to provide those representations to us.
Yeah, and importantly, if we still decide to pursue that refusal, that people can appeal to the tribunal, can't they? There is an independent body that people can go to.
Yeah, they can, yes.
So that's been a bit of a recap for everyone around registration and some of the questions that have come in and frequent questions, but we're now going to move on to the main part of today, which is about inspection. I'm going to hand over to Matthew for this, but we will keep an eye on the chat. So again, if you've got questions that are coming up, please put them in there. But Matthew, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. So we're over a year into the registration work. I mean, we're busy processing the applications, of course, but we're also responding as necessary to any concerns we might have. And we just want to spend a bit of time to revisit and make clear our position about which children we expect to see in supported accommodation, because we're getting a better idea of some of the issues that people are dealing with and the things that we're concerned about to some degree. So the regulations are clear that supported accommodation is not right for all older children. Supported accommodation can be right for some children aged 16 and 17, and they're children who have relatively high or increasing levels of independence. But it won't be right for children who still need the level of care that means that they'd be more appropriately placed in a children's home or with foster carers. And for people who've been to various seminars and events over the last year, you'll know that we've always said that supported accommodation should be caring, and some of the support may look from time to time like the type of care that you typically see in a children's home or in foster care. And we know that all young people, as they approach adulthood, will need that kind of help in certain aspects of their lives, and that their progress towards independence won't always be straightforward. But we think it's really important to say that there's only so much flexibility in the regulations and standards, and we want to assert some of the red lines that shouldn't be crossed when making decisions for children. So we wouldn't expect to see children in supported accommodation who have high or complex needs, whose liberty is restricted, whether on a deprivation of liberty order or otherwise. We wouldn't expect to see children if they require a high level of ongoing care or supervision, and that's including high staff ratios, such as 1-to-1 or more at all times, and we've seen lots of examples of that already. And if they require help and support with personal care, and there's no realistic expectation for increased independence in the foreseeable future, we'd struggle to see how supported accommodation would be the right decision for that child. And we have heard the phrase support for higher needs a few times, including in 1 or 2 questions submitted before today. But we think if a child has higher needs, whether you choose to call it support or not, it's likely that they should be receiving care in a children's home or in foster care. And we've shared a lot of these lines before, but we just want to add another, and this is an important one, that if a child isn't ready for supported accommodation at the point of referral, providers shouldn't be accepting the referral, and local authorities shouldn't be making that referral for supported accommodation. Now, we understand the pressures that local authorities are under, but it's critical that providers are suitably registered and properly equipped to meet children's needs. And of course, if they are providing care, they can apply to be a children's home. And lastly, and we have still seen some examples of this, it is illegal for any child aged under 16 to be placed in supported accommodation. So we just wanted to set those lines out as clearly as we possibly can right from the outset before we start talking about inspection, because this is one of the issues that we will be looking at on inspection. Okay, so some of the nuts and bolts of inspections. Supported accommodation inspections, they'll be carried out under the Social Care Common Inspection Framework, and that often gets called the SCIF, partly to save time. And other types of inspections under the SCIF that some of you will know about include children's homes, independent fostering agencies, residential family centres, etc. And having a common framework means that we look at the issues that are important to children wherever they live or receive help. And the benchmarks of good practice that we use to make the judgments are, wherever possible, consistent across the different types of settings. But it's not a one size fits all framework, and where necessary, the guidance for supported accommodation will reflect the unique and distinct aspects of supported accommodation provision.
So how does that make it different to the inspection of children's homes, Matthew?
Yeah, it's a common question, Lisa. Yeah, I mean, at a basic level, supported accommodations are at the private level, which means we register and inspect the provider rather than each individual property, like we do with children's homes. So that means we will look at some or visit some, but not necessarily all of the premises that a provider operates. And we'll inspect against the supported accommodation inspection guidance, not the children's homes guidance. There's always a bit of overlap, and some people might think, well, that's a similar thing that people look at in children's homes inspections, but that's to be expected. And that's why we have a SCIF, really, to make sure that we do cover those things that are common across different settings. But while there are similarities, a children's home is not the same as supported accommodation, and the way we inspect will reflect the differences. Okay, thanks. And it's another conversation we've had a few times, but worth restating, I think. Just a couple of observations on the language that we use. We use children rather than young people in the inspection guidance. And that's essentially to remind us all that 16 and 17-year-olds are still legally children. So that's in the formal guidance. But we're aware that most 16 to 17-year-olds prefer to be known as young people. So we'll reflect that in our day-to-day inspection activity. We might not always get it right, but that's what inspectors will try to do. And to make it easier to read, another point about the language, that references to staff in the guidance includes supported lodgings hosts, it includes agency staff and volunteers as well. And again, we'll use the language of the setting when we visit and in our reports. Now, these are the principles that are set out in the SCIF, and we'll follow them for supported accommodation inspections. Importantly, we'll focus on what matters most for children. We'll do all we can to be consistent in our expectations, and we'll prioritise our activity where improvements needed most. And that includes the scheduling of inspections that we talked about a little bit earlier. Okay, now most inspections under the SCIF, as most of you will no doubt know, follow our usual 4-point scale of outstanding, good, requires improvement to be good, and inadequate to make the judgments. But for supported accommodation, we're going to use a 3-outcome model for the inspections. And these outcomes were intended to reflect the complexity and diversity of supported accommodations. They are a little bit more detailed, provide a little bit more nuance than the 4-point scale. But they allow us to describe what we see and compare quality across the different categories of services. But it's really important to say that we don't operate a quota system for judgment. So anyone who's found to deliver consistently strong services, for example, will receive that outcome. It doesn't matter how many, we'll be delighted if a really high proportion or even all of the providers get that top outcome. It's worth restating to get the first outcome as well, that you don't have to be perfect. Similarly, if you get the second outcome, it doesn't mean we haven't found strengths. And we wouldn't expect commissioners, and we're pretty confident that commissioners won't take this approach, to choose never to place children with providers who might get the second outcome. We'd expect local authority commissioners to look at the report, see where the particular strengths and weaknesses are with the provider, and take this as part, and only one part of the information that they might use to reach decisions on behalf of children. It may be, depending on the detail, that some outcome 2 providers may be more suitable for a particular child than a service who achieved the first outcome. And the judgments we make, and this includes the third outcome, they're designed to help commissioners to make placement decisions, but they're not about setting rules for commissioners about who they should place children with. These are decisions for the local authorities. And we're going to use this 3-outcome model for the first round of inspections, and just reviewing how it works as we go.
Thanks, Matthew. And one of the questions again we've been asked, which is a very fair question, is how do we make sure that our decisions around those outcomes are consistent? I think as people would expect, we've got a really thoroughly quality assurance process. Again, you'll find some information about that in this inspection handbook. Please take a look. But we absolutely agree that consistency is really important. That's one of the reasons the centralised team that have been working on the registrations will also be the people who are doing the early inspections. So it'll give us a greater line of sight on those early inspections on what's happening. But I think it's always really important to say as well that consistency doesn't mean uniformity. This is a really diverse sector. I don't need to tell people on this call that that's the case. So things won't always look the same. As Matthew described earlier, this is a service level inspection, so we won't be visiting all of the premises, but we will be following our lines of inquiry, and there'll be more about that to come. But it's not always going to be straightforward for those externally to look at inspections and say, you did that differently here to here, because that was probably right. Different categories will mean that we approach things differently, different sizes of providers. But the consistency is about how we use that information to determine which of those is the right outcomes for that provider. Matthew, a bit more from you.
Yeah, thanks, Lisa. Yeah, so people have asked about the frequency of inspection. We're going to be inspecting providers at least once in a 3-year inspection window, and we'll go back earlier to providers who don't achieve the top outcome. And I'll just explain what an inspection window means. It means that each provider will usually be inspected in the 3-year period following its individual inspection. So they each have an individual 3-year window. The 3-year period begins on the 1st of April in the year following their inspection. And that means for providers, for example, who inspected between April 2025 and March 2026, a new 3-year cycle begins on the 1st of April 2026. I hope that makes sense. But if it doesn't, you can watch the recording. For providers where we find serious and widespread weaknesses, we'll usually inspect within 6 months. We'll also always carry out earlier monitoring visits to assess progress. We may decide to make more serious action depending on the nature of our concerns. And just looking at the evaluation criteria, and for those of you who may not be familiar with that term, the evaluation criteria are the benchmarks against which inspectors use to help them grade and judge the performance, and they describe the benchmarks of good practice. They help providers to know what we expect to see and look at during inspections. Inspectors evaluate their evidence against the benchmarks, and their evaluation then informs the outcome of the inspection. And the criteria, and you'll be able to see more detail of this in the guidance, cover 3 main areas: the overall experiences and progress of children, how well children are helped and protected, and the effectiveness of leaders and managers. And they're consistent with the areas that we look at across the SCIF. Okay, so the criteria, just to say a few more things about that. The failure to meet all the criteria doesn't automatically lead to a weaker outcome. It's not a checklist. And some criteria will have less relevance than others in some services because of the different nature of the setting or the different needs of children. And even when all the criteria are relevant, there's always a degree of professional judgment in how we weigh and balance the evidence against the evaluation criteria. So the inspector decides the outcome by looking at where the evidence sits most appropriately with the finding. And we call this the best fit. They'll be able to explain to you how they've arrived at their judgment and what they think needs to improve. And we'll talk more about that later, about recommendations and requirements. Okay, just a few pictures flashed up in front of you there. Just talk a little bit, one more slide on the evaluation criteria. Now, these are a few pictures that showed some of the work that we did with care experienced young people to design and deliver the consultation on the evaluation criteria. The work was carried out over more than a year, and young people also shared their views about what inspectors should look at during inspections. And they also shared their views about other issues, such as how much notice we should give. And their views and all the other consultation responses from the wider sector, including, for example, from commissioners and providers and other professionals, has really helped us provide the benchmarks of strong practice and guidance. And we hope that means it's a consensus of how we inspect. It's not simply Ofsted's view. We had nearly 300 separate responses to the formal online consultation last summer, including more than 60 or around 60 to the young person's consultation. And alongside a good deal of face-to-face work, as shown on this picture, each response has helped build that consensus and informed how we work.
Thanks, Matthew. Just a couple more questions, and just a reminder if anybody wants to put any questions in the chat. Question about external quality assurance. Are supported accommodation providers required to have the Regulation 44 visitor as it's described in the children's homes?
No. There's no similar expectations for supported accommodation. How it will work in supported accommodation is that we will, as you'd expect, we'll look at the providers' quality assurance arrangements and how they work, and we'll be interested in how leaders understand their services' strengths and weaknesses and how they're used to drive improvement that they think is necessary. But there's nothing as prescriptive as Regulation 44 visits for children's homes.
And then I've got another question, which might relate to some of what you were saying earlier about the children in supported accommodation, but also more broadly about contracts. So at the first inspection, will Ofsted be pragmatic where providers have been working closely with local authorities under commissioned contracts?
Yeah, okay. Well, we inspect against our inspection framework and the regulations and the guidance. And I guess what we do is we provide independent scrutiny that's separate to what local authority commissioners may choose to do. I'm hoping and we expect that, and from the conversations I've had, that many commissioning teams will have worked very hard to align their requirements with the DfE standards and the regulations and what we'll be looking at. So hopefully providers won't be asked to meet contradictory requirements.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, just a little bit on the notice period before we hand over to I hand over back to Lisa and Rosie. We won't arrive on site until 2 days after announcing the inspection. This gives inspectors time to look at the information we already hold about a provider. It helps them to start developing lines of inquiry and to plan their on-site and inspection activity, and also to decide where to go and who to speak to when they arrive. But we're clear that and the guidance states this clearly, that the inspection starts at the point of announcement. We may not arrive until 2 days afterwards on site, but we start gathering evidence, and anything we do look at or gather during that initial off-site period will form part of the evidence base for the inspection.
Thanks, Matthew. That feels like a good point, Rosie, to hand to you, because you're going to give us some more of the more granular detail of how it works in practice on the ground. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And as Matthew says, we arrive with you 2 days after announcing the inspection, and during those 2 days, we use that time to review the information that we already hold about providers. And that just helps to make sure that we are using our time when we're out on the inspection to be as focused on gathering the best evidence during the inspection period. During our planning time, we will look at information such as the Annex A that you will provide us. Now, the Annex A is something that was published yesterday and it's available on our website. But the Annex A will ask you to provide us with information, for example, about the staff and details of the children who are receiving support from the premises. And that information will help us to choose who we're going to speak to, and also help us to think about which premises, if there are more than one, that we are going to visit. During our planning period, we're also going to have a look again at some of the documents that you provided us during the registration period. And for lots of providers, amendments were made to policies during the registration process. So we'll look at the most up-to-date, for example, statement of purpose that we have. We'll also look at any notifications that we may have received from you during the period from when you were registered, and that might include safeguarding notifications. We're also going to look at our point in time questionnaire, and these are our annual surveys that we send to social care providers to find out about the experiences of the children, parents, staff, and any professionals that might be involved with the provider or with the child. In terms of the arrangements for coming to announce the inspection, we will call a provider by 9:30 on the first day, and then we'll follow that up with an email, and that email will set out practical information, and it might also ask you to provide us with additional information at that time. We'll then arrange for the person who's going to be the lead inspector to call the nominated individual later that morning. And on that call with the lead inspector, we'll start to plan the timetable of activity together. And we'll ask questions about what's been happening within the settings and within the registration since we spoke to you last. We're going to ask providers to share a short survey with the young people who are in the scope of the inspection, and that tells them that we've started the inspection, and it also tells them how to contact us if they want to speak to us, and it gives them an opportunity to tell us what they think about the support that they are receiving from you. And it's likely that during the first 2 days before we come out to see you that we'll have a few back and forth telephone calls just to firm up those arrangements and to make sure that everyone's clear about which premises we're going to come to first and what time that's going to happen on the third day. And we might use some of the time during the first day, 2 days, to speak to people that are relevant, professionals, or to young people if they've indicated through the survey, for example, that they want to speak to us. It's important that you look at the inspection guidance because that does give the full detail of what to expect during those first few days.
And also, Rosie, that original call is another chance for people to ask questions as well, isn't it? That
absolutely.
Yeah, that's where you start to build a rapport with your inspector. Yeah.
And the communication in those calls is key.
Yeah, I agree. So I've got a couple of questions about inspection. So what happens if we ring up to announce an inspection and there is no one under the age of 18 living there at that point in time?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one that's come up on several occasions during our registration work. And the answer to that is that it really depends. And it depends on if we're able to gather enough recent evidence to support the inspection outcomes, then we will go ahead. But if we can't do that, we might choose to postpone the inspection, and that would be a decision that would be made by us. We won't inspect a provider that hasn't yet accommodated a 16 or a 17-year-old since they've been registered, but that's one of the reasons that we do ask providers to tell us about that, because that will help us in our planning of when to schedule inspections and make sure that the likelihood of a postponement is reduced.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. So another question, how do quality support reviews fit in? Can we say a bit more about them, and a question about will there be a template?
Sure. I think first of all, it's just to say that there won't be a template provided by Ofsted in relation to the quality of support review. This is something that when registered providers need to produce this at least every 6 months. And also they must send it to Ofsted within 28 days after it's been completed. Providers should also make a copy of that available on request to each of the child's placing authority. In terms of what to put into the quality of support review, providers should really look at first of all, the regulation and then at the standard to see what's required and when. And the regulations and the quality standards are going to tell you more about how we're going to use that information to help us to develop our lines of inquiry for our inspection and to schedule those inspections. And importantly, the quality support review gives us an overview of how well leaders and managers are monitoring practice and making plans for improvement.
And one final question for now, will inspections be based at the provider's head office?
And so, as I was mentioning earlier, during the planning stage, the inspector and the provider, so the nominated individual, the registered service manager, together will agree where the on-site inspection will start. And so that might be the head office for some registered provider, if there is a head office, or it might be at one of the premises where the children live. It's unlikely that we'll be based in the same place all of the time, because a good deal of the inspection will be spent visiting premises, speaking to the young people, speaking to staff, and having conversations.
So Rosie, do you want to carry on with what happens next in the inspection?
Sure. Okay, so when we get to come out and we get to meet you, we'll have confirmed the time that you can expect us during we'll confirm the time that you can expect us to arrive on the third day. And what will happen is that the lead inspector, and of course you'll know who that is by the time we come out on the third day, they'll meet with the registered service manager as soon as they possibly can to confirm the timetable of activity and to set out the lines of inquiry and make sure that we know about any sensitive issues that we haven't been aware of prior. And that might be any welfare issues that may be relevant in relation to any of the staff or indeed any of the children. And we recognise that good communication is really important at this point, and we're really happy to answer any questions that you might have during the inspection. And what we will try to do usually is have a daily catch up or a meeting with the registered service manager just to go through our findings and to ensure that we are asking you for example, additional information or providing you with an opportunity to give us more details about particular issues that we're going to talk to you about. We are going to want to speak to as many children as possible during the inspection and to see where they are living and to really look at the quality of their accommodation. We want to speak to staff, we want to speak to managers and key professionals, and that might include police and social workers or their personal advisors, their independent reviewing officers, commissioners, or any other agencies that could be that could have an overview or an insight into children's experience of support. And that might be, for example, college staff or, for example, floating support staff. We're going to look at documents while we're inspecting, and that might include supervision notes or training records, assessments of supported lodging hosts, children's case records, and our focus will always be on how the documents work in practice rather than the format. So how what is written translates into quality of support for individual children. Of course, we'll be flexible about how and when we speak to people. We won't hold all conversations in person, and we will use the phone. We might use other platforms to communicate, and we'll always be mindful of the other commitments that, for example, the children or the young people have, and we'll try really hard to fit around them. We want to make that, we want to make it as easy for them to speak to us as possible. In relation to the numbers of premises that we're going to visit, depending on when the number of premises providers have, of course, we're going to be proportionate in visiting a representative range of the premises, and that will also be about thinking of the category that people are registered for. We will always try and visit at least one premises from each of the category that providers are registered for. We would always expect that children are consulted before we visit them in the place where they live. And similarly for supported lodgings, we'll seek the consent of supported lodging hosts before finalising any arrangements that we make. For each of the inspections, usually there'll be 2 inspectors spending a maximum of 3 days on each of the premises or on each of the registrations. For smaller providers, for example, generally around 5 premises or fewer, it may be less than the 3 days and it may involve one inspector. But our lines of inquiry and the evidence that we find may have a bearing on the decisions that we make about the numbers of inspectors and the time that we spend in the premises. But it would only be in very exceptional circumstances that we would be with providers for any longer than 3 days. And of course, we'd be talking to you about that throughout, and we'd be giving you daily feedback, so there shouldn't be any surprises. And as we move towards the end of the inspection, there will be verbal feedback, and that will include the provisional outcome and the outcomes as Matthew had mentioned earlier. But because we will be meeting with you regularly, it's likely that, as I said earlier, there shouldn't be any major surprises about what the provisional outcome is going to be. What we do notice is that the feedback that we give at the end of the inspection when we're with you in person is likely to be more detailed than the actual published report. The published report will focus on the key strengths and the areas for improvement. This meeting at the end of the inspection also gives the providers that chance to ask any questions or to raise any concerns. The outcome that we share with you when we're with you is provisional. Very, very occasionally it will change following our quality assurance processes, and that's why the inspector will say this is a provisional judgment. It's absolutely fine to share the provisional outcome with any friends or with family or any colleagues, but we do ask that you do that in confidence, because we would want to be mindful that the report is yet to be published, and so just in case there are any final changes, we would be mindful of that. In the reports, we're likely to make, where we find areas for practice to be improved, some requirements where there's a breach of regulations, or make recommendations where we know that practice could be improved. The draft report, we'd send that to you for providers, and that includes any comments on factual accuracy, and we get the report out to you within 18 working days of the inspection having happened. When we ask for factual accuracy, we consider all comments and then we work towards issuing the final report within 30 working days. And of course, if you are inspected, please don't forget to complete the post-inspection survey with any feedback, positive or otherwise. We welcome it, because for us, if there's any learning for us, we want to hear it.
Thanks, Rosie. Conscious there was lots of detail there from Rosie. So again, just a reminder, all of this is set out for you in our published guidance. And in terms of that timeline that Rosie's just described, this slide maybe helps you see that a bit more easily in terms of the notice on site and that process for the report to get to you for you to comment before it gets published. So hopefully that makes it a bit clearer. We have been asked a question about the role of the IRO and what's best practice for independent reviewing officers for children placed in supported accommodation. We just wouldn't expect IRO's responsibilities to be different to what they'd be for children in any other type of provision. And arguably, I think, as we all know, that as children move towards leaving care and adulthood, they need adults who are going to advocate for them and make sure they're getting the right kind of help and have their rights and entitlements met. I'm just checking the chat and I can't see any questions that have come in there that we haven't covered or answered. So just as we sort of round off today, you know, we've got a really strong commitment to you in terms of how we do our work. Our Ofsted values are really important to us about how we work with providers and with your staff, and that is around being professional. It is about behaving with courtesy, empathy, and respect at all times. Again, you'll see more about our code of conduct for inspectors and for providers set out in our guidance. Rosie described the report process for you there, but obviously if concerns arise during an inspection and there's something you're not sure about, always talk to your inspector. They will do their best to resolve your issue or your query. And if that doesn't work, they will have given you a phone number so that there's somebody else that you can speak to who's independent of that inspection. And if it's still unresolved, you can still contact us after the inspection has ended. And as you would expect, once you get your report, you've got that opportunity to comment on anything that isn't factually correct. But obviously you have still got a complaints process that you could pursue. Again, all set out for you in that handbook. I suppose I just want to leave with some notes of reassurance, really. We want to see the best possible practice for children, and we want to see how you do that on a daily basis. We really genuinely don't expect people to prepare for inspection or do things for Ofsted. If you're making good decisions on behalf of children and on a daily basis doing what's right for them, we will be delighted to come out and see that. But we know inspection makes people anxious, and it'd be really foolish of us to say any different. So read that guidance, make sure you know your regulations and your quality standards, you know what's expected of you, and you know what underpins the good work that you do. There's lots of information in here. As Matthew described, we're planning to inspect on a 3-year window, so it will take us quite a while to get to all of the providers. So there'll be people who might be listening to this call and we might not be with you for a number of years. So do keep reading the guidance. You will be part of our general email out where we email out information to providers once you're registered with us. So keep yourself updated. The link that's on this screen, the QR code, if you scan that, it will take you to all the published guidance and the reports, including the very first research evidence review that we did that helped us to determine how we were going to inspect. Lots of things there for you. And on the last slide, there are 2 email contacts for you. One is, as you can see, is about individual registration questions, and the second one is a more general question line for you. So if there are things after today, after listening to this and maybe even watching it back or reading our guidance that still isn't clear to you, then please do come and ask us. We're going to turn our cameras back on and hope that gremlins don't get us in doing that. Let's see. I hope my gremlins don't get in the way again. But just thank you for joining us. Lots of you have joined us today. Thank you for all your questions. We genuinely hope that it's been helpful and useful for you. And as I say, can't say enough times, please look at the guidance. But thank you, and a thank you from Matthew and Rosie.
Thank you very much.
Thanks very much.